Hello, my name is Kelly Gass, and today I'm going to give a brief commentary on Chinese and Japanese paintings via 3 works of Asian art. First, I'd like to introduce Shan Zhou. Shan Zhou Shan Zhou painted Poet on a Mountaintop, and he lived during the Ming Dynasty, which was painted right around 1500. Shan Zhou was a recluse, he was a literati, he was a scholar. He at one time worked for the government, but he decided politics wasn't for him. And being a gifted painter, he really enjoyed time by himself in nature. Here Shan Zhou has painted a little character on the hilltop, on the mountaintop, and it could just as well be himself. He's representing himself here as a scholar, literati, looking out into this big negative space at these beautiful characters called calligraphy. Now within these characters, calligraphy, there are poems or text. It's just written language, just like we're used to in our Western world, only these are calligraphy. This particular painting represents what's called the 3 perfection in Chinese art. The first perfection, you can imagine, it's the entire painting. And then you have calligraphy, that's one of the other perfections. And within the calligraphy is a perfection in itself, and that's the text or the poem. We'll come back to this painting and go over that poem to see what it says and how it relates to this picture. I'm going to go to the second painting now. The second painting by Tang Yin. He was a student of Shenzhou. Misty trees. Well, you can see the mist. It's an atmospheric thing that the painter can do. So it's hard to tell what's behind the mist. It looks like water to me. There's rocks in the water. And this is a hut. And the hut has a fire coming out, probably of wood smoke, because somebody is cooking in the kitchen. That would make perfect sense. And what we have are bamboo shoots, stalks of bamboo, which provide a nice reclusive and seclusive covering and protection around the hut. So you can kind of see how Tang Yin's painting has that solitude and that in nature thing going on like Shan Zhou. Now, their calligraphy is a little different. In the case of Tang Yin, he preferred more of a script calligraphy. And we're going to learn a little bit about what this says too in a few minutes, okay? But we're going to go to our third painting now. We want to show you the 3 main paintings that I'm highlighting today. Now this is a Japanese painting, so we've changed countries from China to Japan. We also have changed times. We're talking, instead of 1500, about early 1900s, so 400 years here difference, right? This was painted probably around 1930, give or take. This is by Koho Shoda. It's called Autumnal Leaves on the Sluice Gate. So we know it's fall or autumn, autumnal. And we can see some of these red leaves, perhaps are cherry trees. We see a small person here on a bridge. And we shall come back to explain this, but I want to introduce a 4th picture here just as a reference, not to explain it, just as a reference. This is arguably the most known, the greatest known painting in Chinese art right here. It's basically virtually ubiquitous. It's found everywhere. Some of the French expressionist artists even had, Claude Monet had a copy of this in his studio. Many of the major art museums in the world have copies off of this painting. And this was done in the Edo period. Edo being the name for Tokyo before it came Tokyo, Edo. This is around 1830, so this is about 100 years before the painting, just before this that I own. We're going to go back then to the beginning, to Sean Zhou's painting, and as promised, we will find out what that beautiful calligraphy says, okay? It's been translated to English, fortunately, for me. White clouds, sash-like, wrap mountain waste. The rock terrace flies in space, distant a narrow path, leaning on a bramble staff. Far and free I gaze, to the warble of a valley brook. I will reply whistling. So it's a beautiful poem that really goes with the painting. So imagine Sean Zhou. Sean Zhou is a painter. He's a scholar, a literati, very educated, but he prefers being to himself. He prefers being reclusive. And that's when he does his best meditation and thinking. But he also has a village not too far away, and he longs for his other literati friends, okay? He's found his own flock, so to speak, and those are intellectual types like himself that also appreciate getting out into the nature, the natural world, and doing artwork and what have you, meditating, writing poems, etc. So here you have a man between two worlds, okay? Society, represented by this little village, and out in this misty, negative space, atmospheric mist coming up from water perhaps. And you can see Sean Zhou used a lot of dots to make his pine needles, and they look very nice, I think. And again, take a look at that nice calligraphy, nice and neat. So I'm going to turn to his student again, Tang Yin. His calligraphy, more of a cursive style. It just looks different, doesn't it? And instead of using pine trees, he was, in this particular painting, he's using bamboo shoots, lots of bamboo. And I might point out at this time, these red stamps, and whoever owned this painting was likely to put a stamp on it, showing ownership and showing their unique stamp of who they are. So it really, the stamps show provenance. And a question often brought up is, well, does it take away from the value? And the answer is no. Probably enhances it, really, because it shows provenance, who owned it. If an emperor owned it, he was going to stamp it. He might stamp it several times, every time he looks at it, for instance, if he looks at it, once a month. So some of them have a lot of stamps, but fortunately here we have a lot of negative space where it doesn't really detract from the picture. Tang Yin, he had a rough life. Unlike Sean Zhou was actually, came from a wealthy family, okay? So he could choose to be a recluse, where Tang Yin came from a poor family, but he was brilliant. And so when he was doing his exams, he ended up being accused for cheating. Well, he was tortured and thrown in jail for a period of time. And poor guy was probably never the same, but he put out a lot of these beautiful kind of works. Now this third artwork, like I said, it's a different country. It's Japanese. It's from Japan, from the period of time when around 1930. So it's about 100 years after the Great Wave that I showed you. But, this individual's a listed artist. He's not the most famous one out there, but he's known. And the nice thing about these Japanese woodblocks is they are very inexpensive. You could buy one for a bowl of soup. It was worth about what a bowl of soup was worth, a bowl of chicken soup. So even today you can buy one, even a signed one, for as little as a couple $100. Some of them go, you know, a lot more than that, but nonetheless. And then I understand that they have even newer ones put out, you know, recent times that are copies of some of these older ones, okay? So it's all relative. But again, early 20th century, around 1915 to 1942, most of these were put out. And they dealt with primary landscapes and beautiful women. And so mine happens to be the obvious landscape. And for each color on a wood block, and they typically use cherry wood, a hardwood like that, and then they would etch it with little knives and put on one color per block. So like the red would be a color, this green in here would be a color, you know, the bluish would be a color. So each one of those colors would be a separate wood block. And they would press it then onto paper with ink, and they could produce them very cheaply. So I had a few questions and answers that I came up with while I was working on this project. One is, what makes early 20th century Japanese woodblock prints so affordable? Okay. Well, the whole idea of woodblock prints was to make them affordable to the common person. And let's think of a common person back in those days. In Beijing, one of the big cities. Or in the case of Japan, let's say Edo, which was Tokyo. They were working in this large city, very close. You looked at buildings, you didn't see a lot of the beautiful landscape right there. You'd have to get outside the city, but when you're working full time, how can you afford to get out of the city, you know, and have the time to do it? So this would give a person something they could get cheap, where they could afford it, and they could hang it in their house. And they could look at it, meditate and dream, and think about, you know, rural life and the natural world. So it was very, very good and helpful to people. My second question, what audience did these woodblock prints appeal to most? Well, they appealed to common people, as I mentioned, business people, lower level officials, higher level officials, urban dwellers, country dwellers. Originally, the local populace would purchase these woodblock prints, but during the Shinhanga or Shinhanga period, when my woodblock was created, these prints were purchased by art lovers from all around the world, and even the Western world was extremely big on them. We Americans tend to love Japanese art, and especially those that are signed, even better, but it's just the art alone is worthwhile. Question 3, what was the general consensus among art experts for these prints at the time they were produced? Well, as a group, the art critics, the purists, weren't really impressed with these inexpensive works. They thought if you had to make art to sell, then you weren't a good artist and it wasn't a good product, basically, because that restricted you in your imagination and what you could actually do. So, whatever. These guys were probably elitists, like would be common. In my opinion, it didn't cheapen things at all. It got these cheaper prints out to the average person, not only in Japan, in Asia, but out to the Western world, Germany, United States, Spain, all over the world. And therefore, I think this is some of the first touch a lot of people have in the Western world of Asian art, these woodblock prints. So, that's a great thing because it increases the knowledge of these woodblock paintings to the rest of the world, and makes Asian art more common for them. So if they go into the museum now and look at Chinese art from 1500s like Shenzhou, or they look at the more modern stuff, they're going to see some commonality, something they can relate to better. So that concludes my commentary. Thank you.